She always gets the first say. Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to today's fantastic conversation on how the best sales managers take AE prospecting from good to great. We're all going to be great after this webinar, but first we got to know our speakers a little bit while people are taking some time to sign on. So let's hear from each of you. What can we find you doing when you're not knee deep in revenue strategy? Basically, what are your favorite things that you like to do outside of work? And Saul, let's start with you.
Sure. So in the rare time that I don't have, that I'm not knee deep in revenue strategy, I just recently got a puppy. And so a lot of my time is spent attempting to train the puppy or spending time with my puppy outside. And actually today is his first training day. So we'll see how he does on his first day of training. Formal training, that is.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. All right, Danny.
Hey everyone, you can find me these days either doing some house projects or getting together an anniversary. We expect our baby girl due on October 15th, so it's coming around the corner. So I'm hectically getting that room ready for her arrival.
Exciting.
Yeah, we're pumped.
Karen.
When not doing revenue strategy, you can find me. I also have a dog who is asleep on the floor right here, but might make an appearance at some point. I also do the New York Times crossword every day. So I have a New York Times crossword streak that has been going for quite some time.
Wow, that's amazing. Are you ever not able to finish them?
Occasionally I am not able to finish them. So it's not during the midst of the pandemic when I had plenty of time just to think about, wait, what is that going to be? I was up in triple digits. These days, if I don't know, I just let it go. And so have not hit triple digits again for a little bit.
That's amazing. All right, well, as you can see, our panelists are super cool and super smart. So let's get into it. We have a lot to get through, but first off, for those of you who aren't a member of our amazing community yet, I'm gonna be talking to you a little bit about MSP and teaching you how you can get started with MSP. I'm gonna put this in the chat here. If you want to apply to be a member, please do. We love it. All right, so to give you a brief overview of our community, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest community for revenue leaders in all revenue disciplines. So typically our members are in the sales space, sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales enablement, and sales development. Our mission at MSP is to create an environment for members to answer the questions that they'd otherwise struggle to solve on their own. So this gorgeous rainbow slide right here displays many of the awesome companies represented by our MSP members, meaning when you ask a question in our forum, revenue leaders from these companies or who have experience at these companies will be offering you their advice. We also partner with thought leading individuals like the folks you see on our webinar today, and different organizations like our sponsors to build out programs that educate, entertain, and challenge our members on topics relevant to today's modern revenue leader. Okay, so let's get into it. Of course, this event wouldn't be possible without our sponsor. So today our sponsor is Atrium, and we're so lucky that we have Karen here who's going to be talking to you a little bit about Atrium and then also leading and guiding this panel. So Karen, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. So Atrium is a data-driven sales management platform that helps managers use data to improve their team's performance. So sales managers at over 100 companies like Sigma, SalesLoft, Sonar, Health Recovery Solutions, Clearbit, and others use the data insights and alerts in Atrium to improve their team's performance. It's super easy to set up. You can log in with your Salesforce credentials, and within 5 minutes, Atrium will show you how your reps are performing across hundreds of different metrics. So if you are interested, you can sign up at signup.atriumhq.com. All right, so on to the reason we are here to talk about bringing AE prospecting from good to great. I will be moderating the webinar and doing double duty as a panelist. My name is Karen Rohr. I am the head of the customer experience organization at Atrium. And prior to that, my background was in sales operations. So I set up the sales operations function at an event marketing software company called Double Dutch that was later acquired by Cvent, and then managed sales operations for North America and EMEA for LinkedIn Learning. Our other panelists, I will let introduce themselves. So Danny, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Karen. My name is Danny Garcia. I lead up the sales team over at Sonar today, but my background includes being a BDR at a fast-growing startup here in Atlanta, and then working my way up into finding my way into sales as an account executive over at Sales Loft, where I spent the half a decade either closing down deals for all the way from SMB to enterprise, then all the way to leading a sales team over there as well for the last 3 years. So excited to be able to chat with you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Danny. Saul, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Saul Garcia. I lead our revenue operations team at Health Recovery Solutions. Most of my experience has been around going in as sort of the initial first hire for sales or revenue operations and growing revenue ops into a full-fledged function and team. It's something that I really enjoy. I enjoy working for high growth organizations, and luckily that's given me a unique view and experience to be able to hopefully share some knowledge here today.
Awesome. Thank you for being here as well. Couple of housekeeping notes for everyone before we get started. The first is please use the Q&A panel to ask questions. You can ask your own questions. You can upvote other people's questions and respond to other people's questions in that Q&A panel. And we will be pulling in questions from the Q&A panel live as we're going through today. The second is the panel is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone who registered after the event. So we will share the recording with you shortly after this. So our agenda for today, we're going to start with how do you define success when it comes to AE prospecting? We're here saying we're going to take AE prospecting from good to great. So what does great look like? The second thing we are going to talk about is how you track progress. How do you know if you're on the way to get there? What metrics are you looking at? And finally, we're going to talk about how often do you reevaluate your prospecting goals to understand whether your kind of key targets you're working towards needs to change. So with that, let's kick off with the first piece of that. How do you define success? So Danny, let's start with you. How do you know if your AEs are great at prospecting? How do you kind of say what a good prospecting motion looks like for your AE team?
It's a great question. The way that I always like to frame that up is you have to work backwards from the actual goal at hand. So for us, we understand that there is a specific split between self-sourced revenue and revenue that's coming in from either inbound or from the sales development team. And once you get an understanding of what that typically looks like across the board for organization, you can start working backwards. And what I like to consider is breaking down big problems into small pieces. So it allows you to understand how many meetings do I have to book to get a qualified opportunity every single week? How do I accomplish that every single day by having X amount of conversations or sending out X amount of emails to be able to convert someone into a meeting, which there allows me to have an opportunity to have a qualified pipeline. As long as you can break down those small problems into even smaller, essentially metrics to engage, whether how many conversations you need to have or how many personalized emails you need to make, you can start working backwards to achieve that goal. And by the end of the week, you can actually achieve a bigger goal that you thought may have been impossible to hit, or maybe more difficult to hit had you not had that specific structure.
And you're talking about, hey, I know I need to set this many meetings. I know I need to have this many conversations. How are you working with your sales ops team to figure out what those numbers are?
Yeah, we're looking at trends on a weekly basis for each every single rep. Right now, I'm overseeing from the operations side with our sales engineers. So it's very much hand-to-hand type of combat. We're looking at metrics. We have dashboards. We use Atrium on a weekly basis as well, understanding historically what are the conversation ratios been right here, which leads to X amount of meetings. How many are we converting over email? And I'm looking at that on a daily basis right now to make sure that there is fluctuation on it, that we can adjust on it immediately so that we can course correct by the end of the week. If not, then we'll know that they'll have an impact later in the month or towards the end of the quarter for us.
Awesome. And so as the sort of sales operations person on the other side of this, how do you work with the sales managers to define what does success look like for AE prospecting?
Yeah, I think at the very top, you're looking at either source pipeline from prospecting and or bookings, right? But when you start to dig it in a little bit deeper, what I've seen, in my role in RevOps in terms of what usually leads to success, I kind of narrow it down to two things: organization and caring. And I'll talk a little bit about the latter more because that's pretty general. I think an account executive's day is pretty busy, right? Every day, every week is really busy. So making sure that you set up time specifically to focus on prospecting is important. I think having a framework and understanding what your territory is equally as important as having success in prospecting. I think caring is really underrated, and it's really easy, I think, and it depends on the sales motion, it depends on each organization, to just rely on marketing leads or to rely on SDRs to provide an outbound prospecting pipeline. But I think it's healthy to also, as an AE, expect for some of the pipeline to come and to be contributed by yourself. I think generally I've seen the AEs that are really successful have that sort of characteristic as well, just caring enough about their pipelines that they can help to fill in the gaps that are needed there as well.
Awesome. I mean, I know from my perspective, both here at Atrium and previously in sales ops, as you guys kind of spoke to, knowing where you want to end up and then figuring out what that looks like so that you can organize your time, make sure that you are committing the time necessary to do that is important. I know for us, it's starting with kind of what's the AE self-source bookings goal, saying, all right, what's my average deal size? How many deals do I need to win? What's my win rate? How many ops do I need to source? And then looking at, Danny, as you kind of said, those conversion ratios from what activities you're doing that are top of funnel activities to creating those self-sourced ops, to say, hey, are we doing the activities necessary to set us up for hitting that goal? A question just came in from the Q&A on, have you seen activity metrics look solid, but have those lagging indicators still kind of not following? And how do you respond to that? How do you make sure that if they're doing those activity numbers, that those activities are quality activities? Danny, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. One of the examples that I have where I've seen this in the past happen a lot is conversations on the phone. You see reps making a ton of dials, and I remember this not only in my time at Sales Op, but even here as well. If you see somebody putting in the effort and having a lot of activity, but not getting the actual end result, it boils down to two different things. They're saying the wrong thing to the individual, or they're targeting the wrong person and the messaging is laying flat. And so those are two areas that you can inspect, listen to the call recordings that they have, and see if they're targeting to the right persona that you typically target. If neither one of those are true, then it could be a situational problem like going into holidays or the world opening back up in this climate that we have today. But those are generally the two areas that I inspect whenever it comes to conversation specifically.
Yeah, I think I won't repeat too much of what Danny said. Although we share a last name, we certainly are our own individuals as well. But I think a lot of what Danny said is correct. I think I think a lot of the times we expect to find the answers within the data, and that's not always going to be the case. So I think you look at the data, if all the leading indicators are there, but the lagging isn't there, if the pipeline's not there, the bookings aren't quite there, I think it's an opportunity to dig in and to find maybe some subjective answers and subjective data and qualitative data to your quantitative data. That's where you might want to, like Danny said, jump in a call, jump in to understand what maybe they're saying on that call, understand their process. Maybe, sure, they're hitting all the emails and the calls, but maybe the messaging's off, right? And so I think that's an opportunity to see what might be off there. Also, if you're seeing that other people that are trending correctly and they're doing the right amount of activity on sort of the front end side, but still are finding success, then that might not necessarily indicate that there's an issue within that process. But if you're finding that everybody is not finding success, then that might be another opportunity to dig in and to see what's wrong with that process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out. Hey, this person might be doing something that's not working versus, hey, maybe we made some bad assumptions about what our conversion rates, for example, would be once we increased the amount of prospecting activity or something like that. And there's one other question, Saul, something you said about having the AEs prospecting. Are you having a separate set of named accounts for AEs that's different from the BDRs so that, folks aren't stepping on toes there?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty relevant to some of the things that we're doing recently. So we're actually building what's sort of known as like a territory framework. So our AEs are sort of leading and owning that process and working with their SDRs. And so I think a part of that is, we don't want to provide this really strict process for them to follow, but we do want to provide a framework for them to be able to follow. And so in there, the AE hypothetically would identify, these are the accounts that I think I'm going to go after. I might have existing relationships with some of these people. I might have had gone through a potential deal last year or 2 years ago, right? Instead of having someone else cold, they recognize my name, versus, hey, I actually don't have any relationships there. Can you go out and prospect that account while I focus on these maybe top 20, 30 accounts? We do provide sort of a direction or framework, but we do also leave some flexibility for the territory team to figure that out as well.
Yeah, I can also chime in that I've seen this work different ways, mostly depending on kind of size of deal, size of company being sold to, where the sort of pod model is more common with large enterprises where the AE is more senior and is kind of guiding the SDR a lot more and what they want the SDR who's working with them to do. Whereas in more of like a mid-market or SMB sale, I've seen more that just AEs, here are your prospecting accounts, SDRs, here are your prospecting accounts.
That's correct. In our instance, it's the former, right? So I would say the average years of experience for all of our enterprise executives is around 15 years at a minimum. So that's generally the case. And if it was more junior SMB, more transactional, we probably would provide a little bit more of a framework.
I've done both, actually. We're doing both currently right now. And I've done it both at Sales Octane here. One of the ways to think about it is we, in a more mid-market or SMB where it's very much more high transaction, we do a typical round robin type of model. And also at the same time, there is that level of mentorship or mentee that you want to look for from the SDR and account executive. So similar thing where you can have X amount of accounts aligned between the SDR and the account executive, that they decide that they're going to work together and they outline a game plan to target those accounts. And that way they can avoid any type of stepping on each other's toes, as the person asked the question mentioned. It gives more of a strategic approach on how you want to get into that account, and everyone gets the credit, everyone gets pipeline, everybody wins. And that's the most important thing. I see a lot of companies focus on who booked the meeting or who sourced it. At the end of the day, as long as there's pipeline in the book, like that's all that matters. And I think is sometimes important to take a step back and remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. One team, one dream.
Exactly.
I do want to move us to the second question, which there's a question in the Q&A that relates really well to this topic. But just to start to get your thoughts, how are you tracking the progress of your team? What are the key metrics that you're looking at to know, hey, are we on track to hit those AE self-sourced bookings goals that we have set up? So So do you want to get started with that one?
Sure, I absolutely can. So I think I'll quickly answer one, but I'll answer what's more relative to us. I think in sort of the SMB space, obviously you could look at, sort of different types of activity, emails, calls, et cetera, right? I think specifically for us, we have a pretty long sales cycle. It's like, around 200 days, right? With a large ASP. There's a few things that we really tried to look at that we have found through Atrium, actually, that there's a sort of a correlation between a couple things that seem to sort of lead to success for us. We sort of make sure that people have the activity on the right personas and or our target accounts or ICP accounts. We sort of try to attack accounts from different angles. So are there multiple contacts and or personas that we're going after, not just one contact per account, right? What we've seen is if there's at least 5, that tends to correlate a little bit more with success on our end. And some of the interesting actual metrics that we really look at in Atrium, we look at contacts touched per account, as I just mentioned, which is a metric that you can look at. We look at new accounts and contacts touched. So it's not just, are you just prospecting the same accounts that you were prospecting 6 months ago? You sort of want to build that sort of activity pipeline and look at other accounts on a monthly basis. And then also, again, to look at like efficacy, what's the win rate on self-sourced opportunities? I think that's really interesting to look at as well. So we've used those to sort of, then we look at those to see who's been successful, and we sort of also go to those reps to see what they're doing. A lot of times we find that they're just doing it naturally, but we try to pull that apart to understand that, so that we can help train the rest of the team on those habits as well.
Awesome. So Danny, what about you? So Saul's looking at contacts touched per account, new contacts touched, new accounts touched. What are you guys looking at Sonar?
Yeah, I'll answer this question a few different ways, and it's very similar to what Saul just mentioned as well. I'll answer it from the standpoint of new reps. So if anyone here has a bunch of new hires starting off, I look at a couple different things. One, overall volume. Are you just in a lot of different places? I see it too often where people have analysis paralysis. They just sit there and figure out, like, I need to have this game plan about all the conversations I'm going to have today and don't actually execute calls or emails. And so getting them moving is one of the main things. So activity at a high level, but specifically I'll look at account penetration, and within the account penetration, making sure we're working the right number of contacts per account. 2 to 3 is a sweet spot for us. And also making sure that those fit within the persona that we have as well. Then take it a step further is looking at the conversation that they actually do have. As you can probably tell, we're very phone shop heavy company. And so how do they sound on the phone? Do they have conviction? Are they able to execute the talk tracks and the openers that we've talked through? Are they saying the right words? So call coaching is really important. We practice a lot by getting the marbles out of the mouth in the morning. So we'll do some practice runs and just making sure that the first words that we say in the morning are not the first words that we speak to a prospect over the phone if we happen to catch them. But for seasoned reps, I'll say you have to take a look at, I came in with the sales team already in place and already moving as well. And so getting a baseline of understanding is like, what does current state look like? And assume that you can make an impact and adjust some of the metrics in a positive manner. So once you have a baseline, you can start looking at, are they being consistent with that? And I think that's one of the biggest themes, is where you can start seeing the ebbs and flows of a rep, so that you can start adjusting and coaching accordingly before it becomes too late to adjust. That can have an impact on the rep hitting their quota or not. But I specifically look at things like, what is their ACV, what is their win rate, and weekly pipe generated. If I can keep a pulse on all those things, I can have a winning formula. But then as well, you can start figuring out which levers you need to pull throughout the quarter so that you can exceed the goals.
Awesome. And related to this, we have a question in the Q&A from Nicole. She's curious what your activity expectations are for your AEs based on kind of the working backwards, particularly around kind of emails, calls, how that should convert to meetings.
I should have mentioned this earlier. The most important metric that I take a look at, and I'm a big stickler about, is day ones. And so I come from Sales Loft, that's my background. And one of the big metrics there is how many people, not only do you add into a cadence or anybody that uses outreach sequence, but actually execute that cadence or sequence is really important. So for us, the magic number is 100 net new people being activated a single week. If you can do that, the calls will follow, which is somewhere around for account executives between 75 to 100. And then for emails, the activity there falls as well to be about 300. By the end of second week, you should have a engine running to where those numbers are very doable and actually become like a cakewalk at the very end of the day. So those are the things that we specifically measure. And one thing I forgot to touch on as well, we're a very trial-focused business. So I also use Atrium to track how many trials we're activating on a monthly basis. We know that if we can activate 5 trials a month, that we will be in a good spot to be able to hit our quarterly number.
Awesome. And for us at Atrium, we also have a trial motion. And so we're looking at the same, how many opportunities that the AEs are sourcing have hit trial so that we can look ahead to say how many of AE sourced opportunities are we expecting to win that quarter. But related to that, Jason Banks has a question. So you had mentioned self-sourced win rates. Have you found higher win rates from self-sourced opportunities than
Absolutely.
from kind of marketing? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. At every organization I've been at, self-sourced opportunities win at a higher rate. And I would also argue that self-source opportunities are actually a higher ASP as well. And I think it's interesting because despite those 2 data points, which is why I assume we're discussing this today, self-prospecting doesn't always seem to be sort of at the forefront as well of strategy. So yes, I've found that across the board, that always seems to be the case.
Awesome. Danny, is that the same for you guys?
Oh yeah, every single place I've been at, the win rate's always been higher and always a faster deal cycle, higher win rate, and also larger deal size. Those things have always been true.
Awesome. I think our win rate actually is a little bit closer between at least inbound, right? The people raising their hand and saying, hey, I would like a salesperson to talk to me, and the AE self-sourced, but we've definitely found quick deal cycles and much larger ASPs on AE self-sourced opportunities. So I would echo that for us as well. We have a question from Brandon Wright. We've been talking in this, we rattled off a lot of metrics that we all use to say, hey, are we on track? But if we are in agreement that there are definitely metrics that we should be tracking, how do we know, or when do we think sales leaders should roll up their sleeves to affect the messaging being used on calls and emails, or when should they not? Danny, do you want to answer that one?
Absolutely. I think depending on the stage of the business will determine how often you're checking on these things. But for ourselves, I'm looking at this on a daily, weekly basis. Our messaging is really, really critical. That's why I listen to calls every single day. I listen to not only what are the cold calls that our new hires are doing and make sure that they're being able to generate pipeline, but also the conversations that the AEs are having on demos to make sure that if something's not resonating with them, that we can adjust and pivot there accordingly. So I think every sales leader should be prepared to roll up their sleeves and should already be doing it if they're not in the weeds on those things. So for sure, daily basis for me.
Yeah. So similar for you or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to be pretty consistent. I think the key with what Danny mentioned is depends on sort of where in the evolution your organization is at, right? If it's an early stage org, I think you definitely have to check that on a more frequent basis. I think as you grow and develop and you get sales enablement and copywriters and so forth that are able to develop this, probably less likely. or sorry, less often. But still, I think it's healthy to still check to make sure that even I think that the messaging is being followed, right? And sure, if you use outreach or sales offer or sales engagement tools, you can sort of enforce and automate some of the messaging, but you still want personalization to a certain degree, right? And so, yeah, I think it's really important to set up a frequency of some sort at the very least. But I think it does also depend on the size of your org.
Yeah, I would always assume that someone's doing it better. I found out that very quickly that I wrote a bunch of cadences for the account executives to follow when I first got here, and it wasn't being adhered to. And I found out that there is way better messaging being used across the account executives. And I learned something and was able to apply it to make a better playbook than we had before. So assume something's better, and don't be too caught up in your own recipe that you made to figure out that something else could be more impactful.
Yeah, for sure. One other thing that I will throw in is I think about email messaging and call messaging a little bit differently to this question, where email messaging, you have a little bit more opportunity to, in an objective way, kind of test, is this messaging really working? On calls, I know for us, if you use a call recording software, they will often be able to give you data like talk ratio time, and you can set up trackers and say, hey, are my AEs hitting all of these key points on the calls? You can look at interactivity, right? How often is the conversation moving back and forth? And I know we've thought about adjusting some of our messaging to improve some of those metrics, right? Like, hey, do we have something set up where we're having our AEs monologue for too long? Let's change this around. Let's like flip the script a little bit to make this a more interactive conversation. And so that's one where we're both using the metrics, but then saying, hey, I feel like based on these metrics, there are some things that we need to roll up our sleeves and do on the messaging side. Awesome. So a few more questions coming in. From Jason again, wants to know, are you making all of the KPIs and analytics that you're looking at publicly available to your AEs? Or are there things that you're just keeping for you as the team leader? So what about you?
Yeah, so this might just be sort of a personal preference, but all metrics historically for me have always been readily available to myself, managers, and individual contributors. I tend not. Now there's some obvious metrics that you do not show, right? But like 99% of them, especially anything coming from an analytics tool or a BI tool of any sort, I keep that completely open and available. So I may speak directly to the manager about these metrics. I might not necessarily go to the individual contributor immediately or initially, but we do make it readily available. And if someone comes to us and like, hey, I heard my manager mentioned this, like, how can I take a look at that? How can I measure this on a monthly basis so I know where I'm at, or on a weekly basis? We make all that available, and we'll create perhaps a custom dashboard specifically for them for things that they're looking to measure. So we don't gatekeep metrics by and large. We try to keep it all available.
Awesome. Danny, what about you?
Yeah, I'm a very big believer in visibility and clear expectations across the board. I believe it helps create a culture of accountability, but also just hustle in general and just some competition. I think nothing's better than seeing yourself below on some form of a dashboard and compared to your peers, where it motivates you to jump on it and just really, really outperform the others. It's just a healthy environment of competition that I think it creates. But I think most importantly, I'll put my rep hat on. Nothing's more demoralizing to not know where you're at. And so I think having it publicly displayed, whether it's good or bad, I think it's just a level of expectation. So you either know and have the ability to know, this is where what I look like today, and here are the things that I can take to improve it. And then you should work with your manager and your leader to be able to adjust and pivot from there. But visibility is everything. If you don't have it, I think that's a miss mark for sure.
Yeah, well, and on some of these, obviously we share all of our data internally. It's kind of the nature of our line of business. But some of these, if you're worried about what's visible and what's not visible to reps, you may not be giving them all the information they need to either be successful or to know what success looks like. And so I think that's much more problematic than like somebody's going to feel bad that they're at the bottom of the leaderboard on this metric. Because, I know in my past life, running sales ops at Double Dutch, that I remember one time where we were changing numbers around, we were changing some of our staffing ratios between SDRs and AEs. And we were kind of wanting to make sure that the AEs were still set up for success, but we hadn't communicated out to the AEs yet, hey, this means that your prospecting needs to go up. And so all these things need to change. And so we weren't setting them up for success because we weren't telling them. I mean, we also didn't have all of the wonderful like tooling that exists today. This was circa like 2014. But I think you've got to be at least reasonably transparent so that the AEs know what they need to do to be successful.
Completely agree. I forgot to mention this, but we're a very Slack business focus in terms of communication. And Atrium, you all just released that ability to send out the Slack dashboard notifications. That's been really helpful at creating an accountability channel that messages out the team every day of the week, something different. 3 days a week, it talks about pipeline generation goals and where people stand. And then 2 times a week, it talks about your monthly and quarterly performance from a revenue standpoint. And so there's constant visibility into what you are doing or you aren't doing. And that goes to the sales team and to the CEO, both co-founders on our team. And so that just gives I want the channel to be a praising channel where everybody is, high-fiving one another, or it can be a competitive channel. One of the best things that I've seen across the board is when a new hire comes in and starts sourcing a lot of meetings. And one of the other reps on the account executive looks at and say, hey, I see what you're doing. I'm coming after you. And that's where I'm talking about the healthy competition that it builds up. That's exactly what you want to see out of a dynamic and in a channel like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. We don't do that. So I might steal that off of you, Danny. So I might reach out to you.
That's great.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, let's kind of segue over. I know we have some questions and we will circle back and make sure we answer the ones. So please keep sending them in the Q&A as well. How often do you reevaluate your prospecting goals? So we've talked about we worked backwards to set up what those goals are. We're tracking metrics to make sure that we're on track to hit those self-source booking goals. How often do you reevaluate? Hey, do we need to reset those standards? Danny, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, on a weekly basis for us. So every single one of my reps during their one-on-ones, they're required to fill out what I call a game plan sheet. I'm very old school in this sense where I physically want myself or people to input the numbers of where they are or aren't, because it just, from an emotional factor, it's like, this is a great one-on-one, or maybe I need to improve certain areas for the week, right? But filling out that sheet gives me an idea of, one, what did they close from a revenue standpoint? That formulates, tell me how much pipeline do they have actively right now? And assuming things trickle out at the current conversion rates, I assume a pipeline number that they need to be able to generate by the end of the quarter to be able to hit their number. And therefore that week, their goal is to source X amount of deals, whether it's 2 or 3 on average, to be able to get back on track or stay on track to hit their monthly or quarterly number. So that on a weekly pulse is something that I always keep my eye on, because it helps me adjust reps for saying, hey, this week you don't have a lot of meetings on the calendar. You've really got to double down on pipeline generation before next week is really hectic for you and you have a focus on closing out a bunch of deals. So it just really helps get everybody on the same page.
Awesome. Saul, what about you?
Yeah, I think, I think it does also depend on the sales cycle, right? I think, like for us, for example, we have a longer sales cycle, but I don't think regardless of sales cycle, it should go any longer than at least every quarter, right? I think, a monthly cadence, I think, is healthy. Even if it's 2 times a quarter, it's healthy. I think you don't want to go into when you start planning for the next year, all of a sudden, if, for example, your goal is initially to have 20% of your pipeline come from prospecting, to suddenly grow to 40 when you could have probably gradually gotten there throughout the previous year, right? That probably was poor planning or poor adjustments throughout the year. So you want to try to evaluate multiple times per year, and then try to make adjustments there. I think when you're obviously you look at, are people hitting their goals? Are we creating enough pipeline? We talked about this earlier, are the necessary leading indicators for success actually occurring? Are the target accounts the right ones, right? I think looking at your ICP, has it changed? Has the market changed? I think COVID changed a lot of markets, right? So is that still the case? I think even if the answer is no to any of these questions, it's still healthy to ask on a consistent basis, right? So I think you want to get into at least some sort of a habit where you have a frequency that you're following when you're reevaluating these goals.
Yeah, well, and ultimately, for better or worse, in many organizations, in almost all organizations, the AE's quota is still the AE's quota, even if marketing's missing their number, even if SDR is missing their number. And so I think there's hey, if we know that marketing or SDR are running behind, as soon as we know that, we should go ahead and increase our AE self-prospecting targets so that our AEs still have a good shot at hitting quota, right?
Right.
So it's very much about, let's make sure we are giving people the opportunity to be successful. But, so I think you're right on sales cycle time. If you have 6 and 7 figure deals and the AEs are only supposed to be self-prospecting one opportunity every month, then it's going to be a little bit hard to know, are you really running, ahead or behind if you're looking at it on less than a monthly basis. So keeping in mind what makes sense for your organization and your sales cycle definitely makes sense. Absolutely. Another thing that I'll toss out is if something significant changes in your business, that's another good chance to reevaluate. So say you just bought sales engagement software for the SDR team, you might expect the number of opportunities that the SDRs are sourcing to go up, right? Or if you just provided it to the AE team, you might expect to get an ROI on that investment, right? And so if there are things about your business that have changed, that's another great opportunity to say, hey, should this change anything else about our numbers? One question that came in is, when you are tracking all of this, is there kind of a single AE prospecting dashboard that you're using that's showing both your kind of inputs, your conversions, and your outputs? And if so, what are the metrics on that dashboard? Danny, I think you have an AE prospecting dashboard like this, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us what's on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, we track calls, emails, conversations, meetings booked, and closed won deals. Those are the main things that we're looking, and then also day ones or new contacts touched as well.
Awesome. Saul, do you have something similar?
So currently at HRS, we don't have something similar, but we do look at, again, thank you, Atrium. Luckily, the Atrium has a couple of metrics that actually are specific. They literally say prospecting meetings, right? So meetings that I think are created where an opportunity is not owned, right? And so we do have some of these metrics and the other metrics that I mentioned in other parts of other dashboards, which are really helpful, but I think it's an opportunity for us to also implement that here as well. I'll also be really transparent that it is the idea of prospecting pipeline and so forth is a somewhat new. It's not new to me because like I said, I've had this at other organizations, but at HRS, it's starting to be a somewhat new paradigm that's sort of shifting in over the past quarter or so. So some of these things we're really starting to implement as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And Andrew is the person who asked this question. Andrew, we do have one on ours is bookings sourced, AE sourced opportunities that reached trial, conversion rate from trial to one, total AE opportunities sourced, prospecting accounts touched, prospecting meetings, and prospecting calls and emails, so activities. So that's what's on ours. So you have some example dashboards you can think about from our panelists. All right, we have a backlog of questions, so I'm going to shift from the when to reevaluate prospecting goals to more of the Q&A. Nicole asked, hey, when you're looking at overall pipeline and where it's coming from, what are you expecting in terms of percent sourced by marketing, percent sourced by SDR, percent sourced by AE? What does that kind of pie chart look like? Saul, what is it at HRS? So
yeah, that's actually, I'm really happy to answer this question. I think it's kind of an exciting one for RevOps. I think this is an opportunity for, if you're a manager, it's a good opportunity to pair up with your sales or RevOps team to dig into this. I think, as I mentioned, you go into sort of your 2022 planning or your sales planning or capacity planning, and you're trying to understand how much of your pipeline should come from marketing, how much it should come from X, Y, and Z, right? You're working with your CRO or your head of sales, your head of RevOps, and so forth. And so I think that's generally where it'll start, right? There's an expectation that marketing will have to provide X percentage of pipeline. There's an expectation that the SDRs will have to have X percentage of outbound pipeline as well. And so I think that's a great starting point to have there. You sort of try to look at obviously everything. You look at the win rate for marketing pipeline, for SDR pipeline, and for self-prospected pipeline. Where's that going to get you in terms of the quotas that are set, and sort of work your way into that number. I would say generally where I've been is anywhere between sort of 20% was actually the smallest percentage that my sales team needed to have, to 35% has been sort of the highest. And I think it does depend on also the side, like where you are in your growth. If you don't have a marketing function quite yet, right, and it's a really sales-led team, that's obviously going to be much higher. That's probably going to be closer to 70 or 80%, most likely, right? So I think it does just depend, but you take the whole picture to understand how much you need, and hopefully that can get you the right percentage.
Danny, yeah, what about Sonar?
Yeah, right now, to actually echo what Saul just mentioned, it definitely depends on where the business is at in terms of its phase of growth. Right now, I'm expecting anywhere between 70 to 80% coming from the account executives, just because that's what we had initially from a sales team. The BDR team is very new, getting ramped up. And so with that said, a lot of the ownership is on the sales team to source and close down the deals on their own. The way that I always like to think about it is very, very simple. Go after the number, and everything else that comes from other sources, whether it's inbound or SDR, is icing on the cake. If you own your own destiny and you take ownership of that number and do everything is possible to get to that point, the number should work out at the very end. And so it definitely would take a look at the entire picture to figure out where do you want to be next year based on the trends that we see today. I think that's going to exercise that we're going to be doing the next couple months to see what do the goals look like for the next coming fiscal year for us. But at the same time, my mindset is always assume that that doesn't exist and go after it yourself. And then you talk about the fun conversation is how much over your OTE are you going to be hitting this next fiscal year if you continue at the rate that you are right now. And those are the fun conversations as a sales leader that you have to have with your reps, and kind of painting that picture for them as well.
Yeah. And I also, from my time at LinkedIn, where I was overseeing sales teams selling to many different customer segments. It was really different for us by segment sold to. So for our enterprise reps, the marketing contribution was really low, as was the SDR outbound contribution. And so the AE contribution was very high. For reps selling to SMB, the marketing contribution that we were expecting was over 50% of their quota. So their own personal contribution was more like 30%. And so really depends on, if you are selling to more of an SMB and you have a marketing function who's good at identifying folks who are trying to solve the problem that your product solves, that's a different sort of a dynamic than, hey, we're selling to large enterprises. There are 1,000 companies total that we can sell to, and we know who all 1,000 of them are, right? So, that kind of account-based marketing, account-based sales is also just more of a joint effort in general, where coordination rather than attribution is really key. So I will toss those two out as examples. Another question that we have in is what advice you have on AE training. So how are you teaching AEs how to prospect well? Are you doing that organically? Are you hiring external trainers to do that? How are you thinking about that piece? Saul, how do you handle this at HRS?
Yeah, luckily, I will readily admit that sales training is certainly not something that I'm spectacular at. So I've hired late last year a phenomenal sales enablement manager to really take over all onboarding, development, and training. And so he's been really helpful for our organization to help grow that. And so that was internal. I think. Yeah, I'm sure Danny's going to have a lot of input here as well. I think, it really depends on sort of what you need, right? For us, it made more sense to bring someone in-house to develop our team. You might not need that. You might only need to hire an outside trainer to come in and to provide a boot camp or something along those lines. I think it does depend. I think it's good to just evaluate all options and then see what works best for you. And then I think there's obviously some amount where the manager probably wants to own part of that as well. But I'm sure Danny has some great insight into this as well.
Yeah, I think learning from just past experience, it's just essentially have the reps train themselves. Obviously, there's going to be curriculum and things that you go through in actual training sessions whenever you're onboarding a new hire. But I think for continuing education, at Sales Loft, we did a really good job of something we called Topic Tuesday. So every single week would come with a new topic and would educate the rest of the team on it, whether that was a sales leader, a sales manager going in there and doing it, or one of the reps that would essentially volunteer to give a session. And that's exactly what we've rolled out here every single morning now. So rather than doing a stand up and talking about the meetings that we have or what we're doing for the day, we're actually bringing a topic to the table, and the rep is taking 15, 20 minutes and discussing what they do as best practice, whether it's around prospecting, whether it's around how do they do a discovery call, how do they tee up a trial expectations meeting, like all those things that are in the weeds, very tactical type of experiences. We're having top performers or people's peers have the discussion, because I think we all been in school at one point or another, and we hear the teacher say one thing, and then your friend says it, and you're like, oh man, why didn't they ever say that before? It's like they have been. It's just selective hearing at times, and so having it come from your peers or the top performers has been the most impactful from what I've seen across the board.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add in here is even if you're hiring an external trainer, there has to be somebody internal responsible for reinforcing that training. So you still need to have some kind of internal resource focusing on AE training. Even if they're not the ones coming up with the main frameworks and materials, there still needs to be somebody making sure that, that AEs are practicing the things that you want them to do on their calls, that the specific tactics that you're trying to use are being reinforced, that they're being built into your existing processes. So has to be something internal, even if you are going external for some of that training. All right. I think we have time for one more question, so we will squeeze in one more. Has anyone structured a new hire goal such that the AE has to hit their goal through 100% self-generated deals before accessing the SDR or inbound rotation? If you have tried that, any pros or cons? Has anybody tried that? I haven't.
I have not tried that, but I'm sure that would be an interesting debate over a few drinks with a few sales leaders. I think, I'll provide some insight. I think I personally probably would not go that route. I think you're sort of, I think you're sort of making someone start behind the start line in a way, right? I think you're sort of I get the idea behind it, which is helping someone become more efficient and effective at self-prospecting. But I wouldn't want that to also hurt someone from reaching their quota or goal, and to not get some additional at-bats from other inbound leads and so forth. But yeah, I see where it's going, but I'm not sure that I would probably go that way.
I'm in the same boat. I understand the concept behind it, but I do think you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because you're not giving someone the swing at the bat. You're exactly what Saul mentioned, starting from behind. I have seen it done where they have to be able to show that they can self-source a meeting before they can go into like a round robin, like an inbound round robin, so that they
Right.
can show that they have the skill set to get there as well, and then they can correctly handle any other at-bats that come their direction from anywhere else, from another source. And so I think that's something to consider, but the other, I just don't, I couldn't sleep at night doing that one.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you have to pass demo certification to get into the round robin at Atrium. So like there is a barrier to entry, but my actual concern is a pragmatic one, which is if they have to hit 100% self-gen before they're in the inbound queue, you're extending the amount of time it's taking them to get fully ramped, which means there's like higher burn from new AEs than there needs to be. So to me, that feels like it's probably a suboptimal decision all the way around for like company financials and for that rep. So I would probably lean away from it as well. All right. We wanted to leave just a minute to do key takeaways before we wrap up. I apologize if you asked a question and we weren't able to get to it. But just kind of, Danny, what is your one key takeaway from the conversation today?
It may not have been said directly, but I'll call it out right now. It's consistency. One of the things you'll see as a theme is just if you consistently do specific actions, you'll have a winning team. And so make sure that you manage to that. Typically you always manage to the exception. So if you start giving some passes in certain low weeks of activity or pipe gen, it can have an impact later on. So just keep things consistent as possible.
Awesome. So consistency from Danny. So what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's, obviously in RevOps, we sort of have this outside view on AE prospecting, right? I don't have AEs reporting to me, but I think it's important for those in sales and RevOps to partner with AEs and the managers, especially to help enable them and provide data that we might see that perhaps the manager isn't necessarily looking at that point in time. And I think it's also just helpful for us and RevOps to just partner with our sales leaders and have a better understanding into like their insight and in how they see the data and how they see the process. And then I think it's also just as equally probably helpful and important for managers to have that relationship with RevOps as well. We can sometimes sit in our silos, but I think it's always helpful to build that relationship.
Awesome. So consistency, partnership. I think my key takeaway is, we had some questions around, well, what level is this goal set at for you and that kind of thing. And mine is that, look, this is really dependent on your sales motion. What is your AE quota? How much do you expect your AEs to self-source? And so knowing for you what that end goal looks like so that you can figure out in your sales org what those leading indicators are, is going to be most important to say, hey, what does my success look like? And so what are my leading indicators that will get me there? Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to Danny and to Saul for being wonderful panelists for this conversation. Please remember, if you are not an MSP member, to go apply for MSP membership. And if you are interested in Atrium, to sign up for Atrium. Thank you all so much. And the recording will be shared with you after this. Have
Excellent.
A wonderful rest of your Monday, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.